Hey there, everyone, and welcome to the final module of this series. This is actually the original module that I wanted to present, but I could not, in good conscience, give this information prematurely without first addressing a lot of the issues that we have when we do perform the steps that I'm going to talk about in this particular module. See, when we report things, we oftentimes report it from our perspective because we want things to work out in our favor. The problem comes in when we do it the wrong way. So therefore, if we're going to make reports about incidents, we need to do it by providing all of the information. And if we don't want to get caught up in a situation where we ourselves actually need to be penalized, then we need to make sure we don't do anything that's worthy of penalty. That's the only way. So with that, let's get into this now. In applying the information in all the other modules, now it's time for us to move forward. So here we go. So when it comes to responding to incidents of misconduct, there are certain ways we need to respond to them at certain times. But one of the things that we need to know first before we do any of this is we also need to know the platform's rules. This is something that many of us, we always overlook when we actually register a profile onto a platform. We have to familiarize ourselves with the site's terms of service and the community guidelines. If we do this, we are likely to find ourselves in lesser snags than we actually allow ourselves to be in when we don't read them and we don't apply them. It's not enough to just familiarize ourselves with them. We also have to understand the rules and we have to respect the rules. Now, why should we respect them? Some of us ask that question, especially if those rules ruin our quote unquote fun. Well, the answer is simple. It's their property, therefore it's their rules. And before we start judging about that, let us not forget this also applies to our own property. So our property, our rules, their property, their rules. Why is that so hard to accept? And therefore, if we do not agree with the rules and if we don't agree with the community guidelines, then our only other option is don't use the platform. Now, some of us will argue, well, how am I supposed to stay in contact with my friends then? There are other avenues, but pretty much all sites, all platforms have the same kind of rule structure. So in this module, and for the sake of time, we will just cover Discord and Twitter. And the links for this stuff will also be included in the video description. So if you want to take a look at them, by all means, please do so. I highly encourage it. It will save you a load of trouble for you to read, understand, and make sure you apply them properly. Because some of the biggest ones that I see on the social networks is there's a lot of harassment going on. There's a lot of slander going on, a lot of libeling going on, which are forms of defamation. And there are some cases also where there's a lot of stalking going on. Folks, these are violations of the terms of service. And some of the material we post may also actually be violations of the community guidelines. One of the biggest issues I'm seeing is people think that the internet is somehow some type of make-believe form as a way of separating ourselves from the real world. Folks, it's not. The internet is another tool of communication and for gathering information. Whatever we type on a social network, there's somebody else on the other side of that keyboard and screen. And they have feelings. So let's get our own heads out of the gutter. Let's get our own heads out of our rear ends, if you will. And let's tune back to reality. There is no escaping reality, folks. We are right in reality, and there are ways we can cope with it and be in a good, sane status. But we have to get rid of all the delusion. So the next thing, when we respond to an incident and we need to report it, we need to familiarize ourselves with the evidence format the site operator requires if we need to file an inquiry with them. For Discord, material that needs to be submitted to them is to be done in the form of either a server ID, a channel ID, a user ID, and message IDs. And there is a way to get that information. So what you have to do is you have to click on the gearbox near your profile at the bottom of the app or on the web interface, whichever one you have. Click the gearbox, and then from there, you click on Advanced, and then at the top, you'll see Developer Mode. Enable Developer Mode. And then once you exit out of everything, the next time you right-click on a profile, or you may click on a message or anything like that, you will see it has something called Copy ID. This works for a server. You can copy its ID. This works on a profile to copy its ID. It also works on a channel to copy its ID. And it also works on messages to copy their ID. So when you need to report a situation to the Discord safety team, you need to send them the ID of the actual element. Then, of course, for Twitter, in many cases, you can just click on the icon that's related to reporting the tweet. Preserve all of the material you have, as long as it's legitimate. So now when we need to address an incident, there is a ladder of escalation, or a chain of command, if you will. In the case of Twitter, and this is just a recommendation, report the tweet and then click on any of the choices as it prompts you to describe what the reason is for the report. As far as private messages go, like if someone's sending you stuff and they're making you uncomfortable, declare a cease and desist to the user, which it could be something like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this conversation. I'd like for this conversation to stop. Please move on. And basically that establishes with the other user that you do not want anything else to do with the conversation. If they continue to bother you, at that point you block the user and then you report them. And here's a link that is also in the description that will basically take you to where you can go to report abusive behavior. On Discord, there's a few ways that this can go about. We'll start with direct messages. Preserve the material in the DM. In other words, don't close the DM. Don't delete any of the stuff. Keep everything there. Declare a cease and desist to the user. Tell them, hey, I don't want anything to do with this conversation anymore, so let's just move on. If that does not work, then of course block the user and report the incident to the safety team. And there's a link in the description below about that. If an incident occurs in a server and you witness it, first of all, know the rules of that server. Besides also knowing the rules and regulations such as the terms of service and the community guidelines of the platform itself, also know the rules of that particular server. Again, we need to start familiarizing ourselves with the rules. And although we might not agree with the rules, we at least need to respect that person's property, if you will. And if we're not cool with it, then we need to leave that server or we need to leave that platform. Simple as that. If possible, if it's something that's happening in the server like a public channel, sometimes you may be able to address the concern to that particular user committing the offense in their DMs. The reason I advise to address it to the individual in their DMs if possible is you want to get rid of all of the peer pressure. This is one of the other issues we end up having. Addressing an offense publicly can sometimes lead to a lot of embarrassment, which some of it is rightfully so. But at the same time, if we really want to get to the core of an issue, you're not always going to really be able to do that with a large group of people, to which in a good number of cases, not all of them respond in the proper way they should in resolving the conflict. Therefore, it's better to just get to a private setting with you and that individual where possible to try to resolve the issue. Now, if that doesn't work, then escalate it to the server staff. And seriously, folks, be patient, collective, truthful, and unbiased when reporting an issue. Respect the chain of command. So if it has to start with the moderator, start with the moderator. If the moderator is not available or they're not able to resolve your issue, then it needs to escalate to the administrators. If the administrators are not to resolve it properly, now be careful with that properly, because I'm talking about the properly in the context of what is right, not what we personally perceive as right. But if that doesn't work, or the administrators are not even being properly adjudicative, if that's even a word, then of course escalate it to the server owner. But too many times I see people bypassing the chain of command and just going straight to the server owner. So server owners, if you have a structure set up of moderation, you also need to enforce that. Your members are not going to take your server seriously unless you take it seriously. Your moderation team is not going to take your server seriously unless you take it seriously. So if you have a structure for mediation, you need to enforce it. And to us as members, we need to respect that. Moving on. If there is no resolution within the server, you may need to escalate any terms of service violations to the site safety team. And if you witness any criminal activity occurring on that server, inform the server staff and assist them as requested. If the server itself, meaning the entire structure of it from the moderators to the administrators to the server owner themselves, is being operated with criminal intent, then you need to report that to the Discord safety team and law enforcement only. Do not engage in addressing it directly to those folks involved. Because if the highest authority within that server is operating with criminal intent, then you are going to have to get operatives above them to resolve it. Moving on, some pointers for the moderation staff. If you witness terms of service or community guidelines violation, or you are informed of that, whatever channel it happens in, you need to lock that channel out from the general members. Why do you need to lock it out? Because you need to preserve the message IDs and all the other information. Because remember, that's what the Discord safety team really wants to see. There may be some cases where they'll use actual screenshots, but in many cases, they want the message ID, the user ID, the server ID, the channel ID. They want that information because that will take them right to the original source. That's how they have it set up. So lock the channel out to preserve that evidence. If it happens in a voice chat, unfortunately, options are limited. But one thing for certain, recording voice chats without consent in most cases is illegal, and usually those are not admissible as evidence. Do not record anything that is in a private setting, such as stuff like this, unless you have consent. Hold any user that is reporting any incident accountable to their testimony. This may sound very unreasonable, but folks, humankind has a tendency to want to fabricate things so we can get what we want. Therefore, moderation staff, stand your ground. Do not be swayed when people try to hound you on how you're handling a scenario when you are handling it in the proper due process. Do not worry yourself about that. In many cases, that's a red flag. And this is the reason why I shared all those other modules about this. It's about our conscience. Do the right thing and share the information for what it is, and then let the others decide. If they don't handle it properly within the context of righteousness, then yes, escalate it above them. But do not be hasty to think that you do not have to be held responsible for whatever testimony you give. And then finally, the Discord safety team. The first link, which is also in the description, will give you a rundown on properly reporting issues on Discord. The next link below that is the report form. And moving on, sometimes we may need to escalate civil issues to the civil court level. This may be in the case sometimes to where there's neglect to resolve contract violations, but that's kind of another topic too. Defamation such as slander and libeling, you'll need to report that to the safety team as well. But if you suffer losses, then you may need to also file a civil case with your local court. Now, I am not an attorney, so I don't know how that's going to work out, so you'll have to hire an attorney and consult with them. One thing I want us all to be aware of too, especially those of us who are content creators or even as just viewers, anytime we try to meddle in someone's business contracts with others and our information is not solid, we could be held liable for the damages. So basically, that's known as tortious interference. It is the act of intentionally damaging someone else's contractual or business relationships with a third party, causing economic harm. And one of the ways this is done is through slander/libeling. So understand, folks, you might want to seriously watch your mouth and watch your fingers on that keyboard. Because if you fabricate scenarios that causes people loss of business, you could be held legally accountable for that. This is no joke. And I'm going to tell you something. If an enforcement entity wants to find you, they'll find you. Hopefully it never escalates to this point, but if it does, which in the case to where we have to involve law enforcement, such as the police, now we're talking about criminal offenses, which are threats to our lives or someone else's life, such as stalking, death threats, cyberbullying, doxing, swatting. Folks, just don't do this. We have way too much potential in our lives to throw it all away over this kind of stuff. This is why I said I could not give this information in good conscience without first dealing with our conscience. Folks, we have to do better with our demeanor. We have to do better. So therefore, I warn all of us, including myself, we are to use this information properly and wisely. We better not misuse this information. No other person we have a problem with is worth screwing up our lives. Therefore, let's do better. Let us examine ourselves and apply the proper social vigilance we know we should be doing. Thank you so much for watching this series. I encourage that you share it with others. One day at a time, we begin to bring our communities back into a safer status. Go in peace, everyone.